Well, good afternoon, everyone. Selamat siang. And welcome to the second ASEAN at CSIS seminar series. And I believe it's the first to be hosted online. And welcome everyone. First of all, before I begin and get on with the show, I'd like to first introduce what ASEAN at CSIS seminar series is, or in this case, the webinar. So just a quick introduction. The seminar series offers a platform for discussion, debate, and an exchange of knowledge on issues related to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And we come to this sort of platform. Why CSI has built this platform? It's because after more than 50 years, we start to ask the question whether ASEAN is still relevant within a region that has been fundamentally transformed. And that sort of fundamental transformation is currently happening, as we can see with the global pandemic of COVID-19. So first of all, I would like to thank each participants who have tuned in, and I hope that each and single one of you are in very good health and continue to do so. And I also want to thank my colleagues and speakers who've joined me this afternoon. I hope you are also in good health, and I hope that we can have a good exchange of mind in a couple of minutes ago. So just a small background and also a rationale of the discussion that we're currently having. We understand that within this COVID-19 pandemic, Southeast Asian states are using different approaches to curb the spread of the virus. And within the regional cooperation of ASEAN, we have seen there are several meetings that have been convened. For example, the 25th meeting of the ASEAN Coordinating Council. And just on the 14th of April ago, we had the ASEAN+3 Special Summit. But the reality on the ground, it seems, indicate that ASEAN's cooperation exists without generating any tangible results. And so the underlying question as to why we're currently having this webinar is that would we be seeing a different ASEAN after all of the pandemic has blown over? And so just to go over the technicalities for this webinar, for example, I just want to remind that this is a 2-hour web seminar, which we hopefully would conclude just at 3 p.m. And we have 4 speakers at the moment. We have Dr. Shafiah Muhibat, which is the head of department, International Relations Department of CSIS. We have Ibrahim Muttaqi, ASEAN from the Habibie Center, the director of ASEAN Studies from Habibie Center, forgive me. We have Tama Salim, international desk editor from the Jakarta Post. And we also have Dr. Fitriani, is a researcher from the CSIS. So welcome to you all. I would like to give each speaker a speaking time of roughly about 10 to 12 minutes, very maximum cutoff times of 15 minutes. And we'll be going through the order as to have been indicated within the invitation. So we'll go over with Dr. Shafiah first, and then Ibrahim, Tama, and lastly we'll go to Fitri. And I just want to give a brief topic as to what the topics are from each speakers. But Dr. Fifi will talk about progress and results of the various summits, whether it's ASEAN China, Foreign Minister, and also ASEAN+3. And then Ibrahim will talk about the criticism of the ASEAN's perceived failures and the importance of ASEAN and multilateralism in general. Tama himself will talk about how ASEAN connectivity is impacted and the overall master plan of ASEAN connectivity. And lastly, Fitri will talk about the different practices of multilateral frameworks in dealing with COVID-19 and other health crises in general. So, first speaker of the order, over to you, Mbak Fifi.
Okay, thank you, Gilang. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see everyone virtually today. As Gilang explained, I mean, ASEAN has been a focus of CSIS for the longest time since CSIS is first established. So I think it's only very in order that we try to discuss what's going on with ASEAN after COVID-19, with the background of thinking that this is a very serious crisis, likened to something that ASEAN has never faced before. So we were asking the question, is ASEAN equipped to handle this? So if yes, then all good. But if not, then something must be changed in the future. On a few days ago, we had an honor to host Ibu Menlu, our Indonesia's foreign minister at CSIS, a webinar as well. So she told us about the different frameworks of ASEAN and international cooperation that Indonesia has done. And we've also read the coverage on the media, the results of the recent ASEAN Summit and ASEAN+3 Summit. So I thought that today, why not we go through, you know, what these results were. Sorry, Gilang, I can't share my screen.
We have the help from our knowledge management team, please. Just to help, over your screen, there would be a button called Share Screen.
It says that I can't screen share. Sorry.
There we go. Can you do it now, sir?
Okay, good now. Sorry.
No worries.
Awesome. Okay. So I'll focus on these two very recent meetings that took place just 6 days ago on the 14th of April. So there was the ASEAN Summit, ASEAN Special Summit, and the ASEAN+3 Special Summit. So if we see the coverage on the media and also statements from all the foreign ministers, so not just Indonesia, from all the foreign ministers and heads of states, there were results that was achieved through all of these two summits. So we thought that, you know, let's go through it and see what the results were. So these are just the front page of the two statements after both summits. So the Special ASEAN Summit is called a declaration, and then the Special ASEAN+3 Summit is called a joint statement. So it's very common in ASEAN format. So what are the highlights? The first one, there were a lot of, if you go through the documents, there were a number of articles, but I can categorize them into four main, as I highlight here. So the first one is the proposed establishment of the COVID-19 Response Fund, so a collective fund. And then the second one is very ASEAN strengthening cooperation in research, development, information sharing, and so on. And then the third one is enhancing cooperation in capacity building and so on. And then the last one is the tasking a relevant ASEAN sectoral body. One thing that is interesting in both documents is that none of the documents call the articles as an agreement. So it says that resolve to. I'm not a legal expert, and maybe somebody here or in the participants can help me, but this is tiptoeing on words, using the words resolve rather than agreement, which we can interpret that this is somewhat still, so most of the things that the four highlights here, we can gather that because it's resolved to and so on, it's basically an idea to establish something. It's not an agreement that something is established right there at the summit. So let's go to the first one. I think it's going to take a lot of time to go through one by one, but let's just take this first one on the response fund as an example of the other highlights. So if you see this, the things that I put in red is basically proposed establishment. So these are all still proposals, and what's more interesting is that when you talk about fund, neither the documents specify whether or not these are voluntary or these are assigned to specific countries. Just as a simple thinking, Indonesia, is Indonesia really ready to allocate certain amount of funding for this response fund when it's established. Looking at the, the ongoing of the whole funding for, resolving the COVID-19 issue here in Indonesia, it's very unlikely to think that, the government is actually ready to set aside some fund to actually, create this establishment of this COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund, or the ASEAN+3 for that matter. If the ASEAN+3 one, if we are depending on the +3 countries, there are no specific agreement on which countries would give certain fund how much and so on. So these are still, you can see that these are still in a very proposal stage ideas. The same ones as in the ones in information sharing and so on. All the words used are further strengthen, assuming that there are already ongoing cooperation, health cooperation in this regard between ASEAN states. So what they are planning to do is, further strengthening, basically through exchange of information. This is the wordings that are very commonly used by ASEAN, that information exchange, sharing of experience, best practices. So so these are the kinds of wordings that are used in this document. The third highlight, capacity building, similar to the second one, using the words further strengthen, enhance, encourage, again, assuming that already existing capacity building measures, cooperation between the ASEAN states. And then this is also interesting because tasking or distribute responsibility to relevant ASEAN sectoral body. So if you see in the ASEAN Summit, the main body that was mentioned is the ASEAN Coordinating Council. So this is basically the meeting of the foreign ministers 2 days before the summit was the meeting of the ASEAN Coordinating Council. So it's not creating something new, but it's using an existing ASEAN sectoral body. And then in the ASEAN+3 Summit, then the main body that is tasked to be responsible in this is the ASEAN+3 foreign minister. So going back to the ministers again. So and then you see in the ASEAN Summit, once you see that there are relevant sectoral bodies being mentioned, and there are also the various emergency response mechanisms, including the AHA Center, but it's not the main body tasked to be responsible for managing the COVID-19 resolution. So these are basically the 4 highlights. And to basically end this and maybe trigger some more discussion is that I'd like to mention one very interesting thing, because this was mentioned by our foreign minister during her webinar at CSIS. She mentioned that one of the results from the ASEAN summits and the ASEAN+3 summits was an idea to create a task force. So and if you see, actually, go through the documents, I was a little bit confused when she mentioned that, because when you go through the documents, there is no mention at all about a task force being established, even a proposal. So after trying to go through, the media reporting and everything, it's actually in Indonesia's proposal to set up a special task force. The proposal was made twice. So first at the ASEAN-China Foreign Ministers meeting, the special one also, 2 months ago on February 20th, Indonesia proposed an ASEAN-China ad hoc ministers joint task force. The second time that the proposal was made was during the ASEAN+3 Summit last week. Indonesia again proposed the establishment of an ASEAN+3, of a special ASEAN+3 task force. It's interesting to note that neither of these proposals actually made it to the end document of the summits. It raises a big question, what's against, because ASEAN is usually very keen on, creating this task force, that task force. If you see that the previous, emergency meetings that ASEAN held, the one that I can remember is on 2015, for example, there was an emergency ASEAN ministerial meeting on transnational crime concerning the irregular movement of persons in Southeast Asia. So regarding irregular migration, people smuggling, at that time a special task force was formed. So why not now? This raises some questions. What are the reluctance of some states to actually create this task force? So yeah, just some ideas to start off the discussion. What we have, we've been hearing about the ASEAN summits. Now you can try to analyze together with me based on the actual documents resulting from the summits. I'll hand back to you, Gilang.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Fifi. I'm not going to try to conclude all that. Just saying how interesting that the response fund is currently still an idea and proposed. I think we'll be seeing couple of moments until it's certainly materialized into a tangible results. So we'll be going to the second speakers very soon. So over to you, Ibrahim.
Okay, thank you so much, Mas Gilang, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to all my fellow speakers, and also to everyone who's following on the webinar. So I think in my presentation, what I'd like to do is to focus on some of the key questions that the organizers gave to me earlier today on what is ASEAN doing and how would ASEAN member states continue to cooperate after the COVID-19 pandemic is over, and then looking at the minimum impact that ASEAN has contributed in the midst of the pandemic. Does this not indicate that ASEAN is incapable of confronting its challenges? And would we be seeing a different ASEAN after all of this is over? I think before I give my responses, I think it's very important for us to put the COVID-19 pandemic in its context. As we heard before, this is a very unprecedented situation in terms of the scale, the scope, and the speed. So in just a few months, pretty much every corner of the world has been affected. Every sector of the economy has been impacted. And what was initially a public health crisis has transformed into an economic one. And if we're not careful, it has the potential to turn into a social political one as well. So I think maybe one way to underline just what a unique situation we're in, it's worth pointing out that the only other time a Summer Olympics was postponed or cancelled was because of the First World War and the Second World War. So in a way, this COVID-19 is like a World War situation, but this time against a silent, invisible enemy. And the reason why I'm raising this point at the beginning is because I think it's very easy for us researchers, the media, and members of the public to sometimes maybe point fingers at ASEAN and say it should do more of this or do less of that. But ASEAN doesn't operate in a bubble. It is very much in the same situation that all of us are in. For example, the staff of the ASEAN Secretariat, I understand that the majority are also working from home. It has been forced to conduct meetings via teleconference, such as the Special ASEAN Summits last week. And they've had their events being postponed or cancelled. So on the one hand, ASEAN has had its fair share of criticisms about its limitations and weaknesses under normal circumstances. So in this pandemic situation, those limitations are going to be exacerbated and going to be even more so than previously. So turning to the question of how would ASEAN member states continue to cooperate after the COVID-19 pandemic is over, personally, I don't think much will really change. So on the one hand, there is this argument that the ASEAN has failed, that member states are going their own separate ways, that there's this rise in populism, in nationalism, in xenophobism, and that all this is meant to signal that the end of the type of multilateralism that ASEAN represents. But I would personally argue differently and say that the COVID-19 pandemic has served to underline the importance of nations working together and cooperating with one another. So on the one hand, yes, our governments have come up short in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is certainly the case in Indonesia as well as with other member states. But there's also much for us to learn from one another in terms of the best practices, in terms of lessons learned, in terms of mistakes made. And for example, right now there's a lot of attention being paid to Singapore in its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are also other member states such as Vietnam who, although they don't have the same resources or technological advances as Singapore, they've done a very good job in keeping the pandemic under control. The other point I would like to make is this, that the solution to the pandemic lies in international cooperation. So scientific cooperation amongst the world's best scientists will bring about a vaccine. And economic measures agreed by the world's best economists will bring stability to the market. And cross-border trade will bring about the uninterrupted and affordable food supplies and other essential goods. So on the one hand, globalization or multilateralism or international cooperation that ASEAN represents may have brought the problem of coronavirus to our doorsteps, but it will also bring about the solutions to the problems that it has brought about. In terms of the second question regarding the minimum impact that ASEAN has contributed and whether this indicates that ASEAN is incapable of confronting its challenges, I will go back to the analogy I made at the beginning about the fact that this is a sort of a world war situation. And on the one hand, this is something that's not new. We have to admit the fact that no country, no regional organization could be expected to be fully prepared for this. And even the world superpowers have been struggling. And as Dr. Shafiah mentioned earlier, ASEAN has been doing its part with its special ASEAN summits and the ASEAN+3s and the plans to have a ASEAN+3 task force. And also last month, there was also the special ASEAN-China summit as well. So in this sense, ASEAN has not been silent. And while some people might say that these events have just been very much symbolic, I would disagree. I think these summits are important reminders to our leaders, to the governments, to member states, that we're not in this alone. We can and should rely on our neighbors for help and assistance. So that was a very important message that came from these summits. And then the last question of, would we be seeing a different ASEAN after all of this is over? I would say that traditionally ASEAN has always adapted itself after a crisis. And we saw that after the Asian financial crisis, we saw moves towards an ASEAN community and greater regional integration. At the height of the Cold War, we had the first ASEAN summit, which has now become a regular feature. And I believe that following this pandemic, ASEAN will adjust itself again. And going back to my comparison with the World War analogy, in the weeks and months when all of this is over, we will need a post-pandemic recovery in the same way we had a post-World War recovery. We will need to get the economies moving again. We will need to put people back into the labor force. We will need to restore demand for our goods and services. And this is very much what the ASEAN community is all about. So in conclusion, I would say that the ASEAN community will be needed more than ever. And the global COVID pandemic will only reinforces that fact. So with that, I'd like to hand back to Mas Gilang.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for the optimistic viewpoint on ASEAN and its endurance and also resiliency in the face of danger. Now, we'll be going to our third speaker. So without further ado, over to you, Tama.
Thank you, Gilang. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Well, first of all, good afternoon to everyone, my fellow panelists and everyone who's watching. As a journalist, I think it's important to at least acknowledge the kind of news coverage that ASEAN and the ASEAN response to the pandemic has actually, shown. And even so, I would actually just like to briefly say that the public information on the response itself has been somewhat sporadic and minimum. But then, of course, we have to see this as I suppose, it has to do with the sectoral nature of this pandemic, I suppose, and I will talk about again a bit later. So by my personal observation, there isn't really any collective response from ASEAN yet after we parse all of the updates. It is, as our panelists have said before me, that it is a sort of a every man for himself situation, and that the general public, they wouldn't really know too much what is happening at this plane. So again, to kind of return to the recent summitry last week, for our intents and purposes, it pays the lip service needed that the people want to hear, that there are efforts being done. But then again, we have to acknowledge, acknowledging a problem is only half the battle. And I think ASEAN has done that quite well. And we've seen a response from January even. And there are people looking into this, and I suppose in that sense we can rest assured that this isn't something that ASEAN as a regional organization is kind of sweeping under the rug or something. It's still inarticulate in that sense, and ASEAN has always been sort of mercurial in that sense. But it isn't doing much in terms of favors, especially if it tries to be relevant to its people. My second argument, I think here is that I'd like to drive home the point that the pandemic itself has been somewhat of a stress test for the ASEAN community building project itself. We all know that at least implicitly, that the ASEAN economic community would be considered the most important of the three pillars of the bloc, the biggest priority, so to say. And so if there is one thing we can all agree on in ASEAN, it is achieving prosperity. And that was sort of the foundation that ASEAN was built on. But there is, of course, there are, I suppose, other effects to this, side effects to this, because the economic framework has its weaknesses, and we see that clearly reflected in the current pandemic. From an economic perspective, the ASEAN community is built on connectivity. So we are geographically very close to each other, and this is something that we've tried to tick off the list. We try to keep kind of tear down all the barriers as to movement of people, movement of services, financial service, and all of that. But I'd like to look into the big document that kind of underpins everything. This is the Master Plan for ASEAN Connectivity 2025. So due to be reviewed, I suppose, in a few years' time, but it's relevant nonetheless to look at it now, because in this document alone, we can see that healthcare is considered or is not considered a legitimate concern in its own right, not even as a basic human right. So the MPAC document itself, the closest it gets to defining connectivity in relation to a nation's fiscal capacity. So whether or not healthcare is politically becoming a long-term infrastructure investment for a government, or whether the health sector is kind of reliant on data networks that need to be a collaborative process, I suppose, among the countries. You may argue that maybe I may be looking into the wrong document when it comes to the connectivity in the context of pandemics. But it also goes to show that these documents can be very siloed and disconnected, and that in the ASEAN economic community, the focus is definitely on industry, whereas in the socio-cultural community blueprint, ASEAN has one as well, and therein lies that strategic objective that ASEAN wants to enhance regional preparedness and capacity on the surveillance, the prevention, and the response to communicable and emerging infectious diseases. So I think that's quite unfortunate in one sense, because connectivity, it's something that ASEAN has worked so hard and long to develop, especially in the last decade. We've been trying to eliminate these barriers of movement and trade, but it's also complicit in allowing this swift spread of the COVID-19. But on the other hand, it's not good enough yet to empower the region's health sector, whether at the national level or as a collaborative effort. And I think this is mostly due to this economy first mindset that that has been the basis of regional cooperation. So just a little look into the impact document, of course. Healthcare is seen as an industry. The group's priorities are informed by the need to liberalize trade policy in the health sector. And so this includes improving cross-border healthcare and work opportunities, kind of promoting such things as medical pilgrimages, I suppose. And then the other part to that is expanding worker visa regimes and establishing some sort of standard procedures among members. And that's kind of what occupies the top 3 things to do for ASEAN. But even like for this focus on economic data, it's still disproportionate in the sense that, it is easier to find data sets on the potential of the health sector, let's say, which is about $20 to $53 billion by 2030 regionally, as opposed to, as Dr. Fifi mentioned earlier, that how big is the COVID response fund? Based on what I've heard and what I've been trying to dig in for myself, I think the fund stands at the moment at $13.3 million. And that is it's still a very early, I suppose, figure. And I doubt it'll be like the final figure, because we're looking at 10% of cooperation funds that ASEAN maintains with a lot of its partners. And if we look at the major partners, we have quite a few resources there. But it doesn't quite inspire confidence, even among ASEAN enthusiasts, let alone the 200 million people that have no idea what ASEAN is doing. And the other thing that the pandemic has proven is that even the most developed countries and the most well-prepared ones with the best healthcare systems, they can still fall victim to the outbreak. And it's sad that about a decade ago, I think at the time, the late great Surin Pitsuwan, the ASEAN Secretary General, he highlighted this need to put in these safeguards against infectious diseases. But now, 10 years later, almost, ASEAN is still very much underprepared. He reminded people that there is a cumulative burden of mortality that affects economic growth. And I think this is something that would appeal very much to all the countries in ASEAN. The fact that he says that these threats are a direct challenge to the attainment of peace, progress, and prosperity in ASEAN. And that was said in 2011, and it's still the case now. So at this point, I can't really say I can't measure how much ASEAN has progressed in the last decade. But we can see from the summitry last week that they're only starting to do things. As my colleague rightly so pointed out, they are proposing things and they're resolving to do things together. So really, it's just the beginning. And while this has to be commended, of course, the bloc is, at this point, I think, really only capable of responding to the economic fallout of the pandemic, as opposed to actually mitigating the immediate health risks. And unfortunately, that process itself will likely exclude many of the region's vulnerable groups. So we're not looking hard and long enough at health as a human right here. So I think that needs saying. So one of the things that can be said is that ASEAN needs to recalibrate its principle of the lowest common denominator here. We've had, I think, an editorial in the last week alone, kind of mentioning this in the newspaper, saying the weakest link if the weakest link continues to be weak, then it can even break the strongest chain. So in that sense, I think ASEAN needs to tweak a lot here. It needs to stop progressing as business as usual, and that would be my takeaway, I think, for ASEAN after it survives this COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Gilang.
Okay, thank you, Tama. I'm afraid that the chink in the chain maybe at the moment is a bamboo armor, and I think it's still very weak in regards with the full metal stainless steel ones that possibly our neighbor would want us to garment ourselves. So thank you for that argument, and also what you mentioned about the ASEAN's connectivity and community, of course. And last but not least, I'd hand over to Dr. Fitriani. All yours.
Thank you, Gilang. Thank you for having me. I am glad to be here, and I think that everybody have the same hairstyle of lockdown now, self-isolation. Just so pardon my hair right now. I'm trying to be as neat as possible. So without further ado, I will share my PowerPoint to cover my face. Different with other speaker, perhaps, I will share about the lesson learned of other multilateral framework comparison that ASEAN can perhaps learn from and move forward to. Okay. I will start my presentation by the introduction, following the lesson learned from the United Nations, the situation from what we can learn from the G20 that Indonesia is very much involved in, learning from the European Union as perhaps learning from the regional organization that also experience border crossings. We know that European Union have really free movement of population. Fifth, learning from the African Union. How does developing countries actually managing their health and disease situation, especially from the minimum budget perspective, perhaps. And sixth, where will Asian be? Of course, as a scholar, we only asked to talk about the future problem in conferences. So I'm not playing Mbah Dukun or shaman here, but so this is how I will approach things. So I will take the introduction of the theory of where are we, and I'll take the methods of the future thinking of the 3 horizon framework. This means that we learn the world in a kind of a parallel situation. There's the situation that is now and what the changes will be. And we know the changes right now that we are forced to face is the COVID-19. And it's just like the same joke of like, what makes your company implement IT system? Yeah, it's not the CTO, but the COVID-19. So what's broken now? We know what's broken now, our health system, our contingency plan, perhaps, and then what we want in the future. So what's the hopeful future is the alternative that we go forward to. And then taking that, the COVID-19 situation, this crisis might stay quite some time. Perhaps we can learn from our best practices that we have now of what's worth keeping. What are we have done that actually been working, and then perhaps take away the things that make us really unproductive, blaming each other, and like making the situation more stressful than it is, and not focusing on the solution. And then at the end, I would came out for ASEAN 2 scenario. First scenario would be how about if ASEAN can take the good lesson learned from what we have right now, what can we bring forward, and what's the learning that we need to be agile to move forward to. And the other scenario is the less rosy scenario that we need to be ready. And I will discuss that later on. I will move on to the learning. So this is what the learning of what the current world multilateral framework has been going for ourselves. First, I would share to you the learning from the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations is one of the biggest and long-standing multilateral institution. It has dealt with the Ebola crisis that was issued as a resolution by the United Nations Security Council as a crisis of health that actually disturbing global security and stability, and therefore united effort has been should be put in place to handle this. Because it was issued Security Council resolution, the resolution is binding. That meant that there is a budget of the peacekeeping and Security Council that goes to tackle the Ebola crisis. That was in the 2014 only contained or managed to be contained by the UN only in the tip of West Africa. That is Liberia, Guinea, and the areas around. Because of that crisis, the shift UN resolution, money coming to that crisis handling, the crisis ended or declared to be ended in 2016. So 2 years, the crisis has been managed and solved by the United Nations in collaboration with the peacekeeping effort that is establishing the task force of handling Ebola, and then with the health research and the health management is led by the WHO. Unfortunately, in the 2020 crisis, we don't see this international collaboration coming forward. Why? Honestly, because the country that was previously supporting the Ebola crisis handling actually impacted as well by the COVID-19, and they don't have money to support, or they actually don't know how to deal with the crisis if it attack at home. So it's the first failure of the multilateral, the UN system is not maintained to contain it in the Wuhan and the China, the first hand. But perhaps it's best not to blame each other, right? The UN already have the General Assembly resolution and the global solidarity to fight COVID-19 initiated by Indonesia as well, that appointed the WHO as the main organization. This is important. Why? Because it needs to have an institution that led the crisis handling. And the WHO has the experience of handling the Ebola crisis, and it learns from in the beginning that it does not have ability to control the logistic. And in learning from the past experience, the WHO currently already have a coordinating mechanism with the ICRC, with the peacekeeper, to actually help how to supply medical equipment, and then coordinate the health research for vaccine and alternative medicine to cure the COVID, hopefully. That's the first resolution that issued in March. And the second resolution issued in early April is United Response, again, Global Health Threats Combating COVID-19. Indonesia is also part of it. It actually pushed for global financial support for ending this crisis. That resolution identified the priority group that should be protected, that is senior people, as well as women and girls, as well as pushing forward for coordination. It means by information sharing, but coordination, most importantly, that useful for ASEAN is coordination in the not only national, international, but also in the regional level. However, we still hasn't seen any resolution in the UN Security Council that is binding to mobilize peacekeeper. And we know that there's a challenges with the UN system right now. There are countries that, because they cannot pay the annual contribution, they cannot pay. And then there are major countries that said that they don't want to pay their contribution to the WHO, the World Health Organization, in the middle of crisis, because they say the WHO is not effective, so on and so forth. And we also see, spoiler, we know that there is a major country that is facing an election and using this COVID as a way to blame other country to win support for the politician position. We know this big country, I don't need to name it, and is actually trying to make news to rally to blame other country, and it's weakening the international system. So this is what we learned not to do from the United Nations, and what we learned that we can do from the Ebola crisis handling by the United Nations. Second learning is from the G20. The G20 conduct under the Saudi Arabia chairmanship this year is conducting online G20 Leaders Summit. And it is committed to inject over $5 trillion to the global economy and endorse temporarily debt relief for poorest country. That just happened a couple of days ago, which is allowing poorer country not to pay its debt for the next 6 months. And it's actually very helpful. Committed to expand manufacturing capacity for medical supplies and ensure that the medical supplies would be available in it will not be expensive, and it will be widely available without actually being hoarded by a certain country. And also coordinating with WHO, IMF, World Bank, and others how to actually provide financial stimulus. They also conduct a joint meeting of finance ministers and health ministers. The health ministers meeting just just opened yesterday, and hopefully we'll see something useful coming out from there. And the finance minister meeting of the G20 actually already successful in committed to the debt relief. So what we learned from the G20 is financial stimulus is important, and we realistically have to do this. Learning from the European Union. European Union is regional organization. As we know, ASEAN already implement border restriction, and is not different with other regional organization that actually lowering its trust to its neighbor, because the neighbor country has more COVID cases compared to them, and then they're just trying to protect themselves. This is the restriction that they put in place, and the more severe the number of cases, the more heavy the restriction implemented. And European Union is trying to grapple and thinking what it can be done, and actually it actually bind together as a regional organization. It focuses not on the differences but focus on the same interests. So what are the European Union interests? Of course, to return the citizens that are stranded in other countries. So they actually hire a chartered plane and repatriate 500,000 EU citizens with the joint share budget, establishing standard of health equipment, testing kit, so making the production, that fast production up to standard, and then joint procurement as well, because procuring in bigger volume, meaning it will lower the price, of course, and also joint vaccine research. Is this kind of regional joint activities that they have built center of excellencies so they can talk to each other. And also they actually implement mechanism of the flow of goods, because the food can be of shortage, and they made a commitment of how to make the food can still be traveling across the border. And the EU also implement budget support to unemployment and to business. The business is big because they know there is part of the big businesses that they want to prevent from collapsing. Those health businesses, of course, manufacturing that support health equipment, of course, as well as small and medium businesses, as well as investment as well, so that the business can move and agilely transform their businesses from the non important to the one that is really used right now. And maybe surprising that they actually have a roadmap of lifting the containment, because for European Union, they already committed to have like a movement of people, and they actually have a roadmap. And what the roadmap said is not, this is just a guidance, you don't have to follow it, but if you want to slowly open when you think that things are under control, this is how you can do it. So this is actually a very good lesson learned on actually how to focus on what we can do and what the region needs. This is European Union, and the last example is from the African Union. African Union is a country, a region that was impacted previously from the Ebola crisis. That is also really deadly and contagious. The death percentage is actually twice of the COVID-19, and it doesn't have any medicine as well. So what African Union do is actually in their website actually publishes how many cases in the region has, how many deaths and how many recoveries daily. And they have actually published a joint Africa joint strategy on how to handle the outbreak. African Union have the Center for Disease and Disease Control and Prevention, and it issues guideline and policy, for example, how to do social distancing, what is the good health support. So each country can adopt that. They can go to the African Union website and they can download that mechanism. Even people public can go there and see what they can do for themselves. So it's really, African Union is using its website as part of the supporting the African community. They have the African Task Force for Coronavirus that is filled mostly with professional doctors, so no politics there, doing research and having task force what to do. And they actually also provide a public updated press briefing and diplomatic effort. For example, when there's actually racism attack for African in China, the diplomat from African Union actually coming and then saying like, oh, what we can do, and then it's really, and they show it in the website of African Union. So showing that the region is really united. It's something that we can learn from the African Union. So where will ASEAN be? I know I'm taking so much time, I'm sorry, but we're lucky that we have Vietnam as a chairman for ASEAN this year. And I think Vietnam, as a good example, managed to lower the case of contagions by doing it really smart, awareness raising, learning from their experience facing SARS and avian flu. And what we can learn from these two scenarios, the hopeful is that ASEAN can be agile and it can actually focus and learn from other multilateral forum and what they can do and what they should not do. For example, ASEAN should commit it, and I can see that ASEAN is trying in adjusting their joint statement declaration from the ASEAN government to the Asian community. So involving not only the government, but also the people and the whole community itself. And the second scenario is not so hopeful, that we are actually blaming other country, our neighbors, ASEAN neighbors. So it's like, you're mismanaged, you're not committed, you're not transparent, so on and so forth. And that is a bad example. So I end my presentation there. Thank you, Gilang. Now it's I return it to you.
Very well. Thank you very much, Fitri, for the very comprehensive presentation on the various multilateral frameworks and how they are dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic. And I thank you to all the four speakers who have presented their arguments and also what their opinions on ASEAN and other issues relating to this pandemic. And now we'll be going to our discussions and the Q&A. So far, we already have several questions in mind, and I'll take several as well. And I'd like to exercise my right. This is what I like best as a moderator. My right as to present a question for myself to all the panelists, and I'll try to combine it with someone if it's something similar. Yes, so maybe I just want to ask to the panelists. Fitri mentioned in her slides, the last on Vietnam's chairmanship, and how it's in a way she presents two scenarios, so hopeful and not so hopeful. But in my mind, I'm just wondering how the chairmanship of ASEAN, how has Vietnam how have they been taken aback by the situation, that at this moment in my perspective, it's possible, I'd say, for external powers, or maybe you can correct me otherwise, external powers to perhaps steer its political agenda within ASEAN, or have we not have ASEAN at the moment as ASEAN's chairman? Would we be in a worse off situation? I suppose I don't know if it's something that any one panelist would want to comment on this. And I also want to bring up one question from Panata Gamas, where he also in some ways asked, how has the health crisis, how has it evoked or shown the weaknesses of the government's process and responsibility to carry its duty? So I suppose in a way it's how this whole thing, how has this shook the system, the ASEAN system, both unilaterally within the countries and also, in multilateral terms, through the chairmanship and the other 9 ASEAN member states. So maybe I can go over from Fitri and then I'll go back to Dr. Fifi. So we'll go to the reverse order at this stage. Go ahead.
Thank you, Gilang. How does the Vietnam chairmanship currently? I think Vietnam managed, because we saw how it handles the situation of COVID-19 very swiftly, and then it actually managed to show its leadership by conducting the online meetings, as well as also being very responsive in sending the support. And your question is a bit tricky for me about the involvement of great power in the region through Vietnam. Is that what you're trying to imply?
I'd just like to say, in the midst of this whole pandemic, I think either Ibrahim or I think Bafifi already mentioned that there are other issues that ASEAN is also facing, right? It's not just COVID-19. We're not going to be naming it unless we want this whole topic to come burden upon us. But I just say that due to COVID-19, has the chairmanship been taken aback that ASEAN has managed in a very minimum way, able to handle all the other issues that it's facing, whether it's South China Sea or whether it's how should I say, not overseas traffic, criminal organization, etc. So we have so many issues. So how has this one single pandemic managed to just shook the chairmanship's position to cater to all the issues that ASEAN is facing currently? So that's pretty much the gist of my question.
For me, so maybe other panelists can fill me up, fill my answer. I think it's beneficial that Vietnam is also sitting at the United Nations Security Council at the moment, and it's actually bringing the international level to the regional level, and as well Indonesia is also sitting in the Security Council, and it's bringing the international regional dynamic, and I think that Vietnam can learn from what happened, the meeting that is happening in the Security Council, and we know there's 2 major power bickering there, trying to not putting that fight in the greater multilateral to our region. It's actually quite beneficial. We are what I see, perhaps my perspective is like we're bringing the ASEAN+3 is because they have the budget and they're closer to us, and then we kind of hope that we can get the funding from there. So what I also think is that ASEAN need, talking about the future, to think about how to have the fund that can be fastly disbursed, and that kind of mechanism will help. And not so much about the great power. I'm welcoming if the great power want to come and give us like medical equipment, of course. Yeah, other panels, please.
Okay, Tama, do you want to have some comments on or answer to any of the questions, the 2 questions I just posted? I just mentioned earlier.
Okay, I think I'll try to answer. Well, the obvious shaking, as you said, of the system, I think is most apparent in the fact that it's every man for himself, regardless of the multilateralism that ASEAN is actually kind of in a limbo right now, even with Vietnam as the chairman. Vietnam, for all intents and purposes, I think Vietnam should be leading this COVID response because it has really done well. But we don't see this immediate kind of sharing of best practices, or at least there isn't any visibility in what they are doing, what they are saying, all the best practices that is being shared, the information that is being shared. And I mean, we can see this either politically as very ASEAN, as a very ASEAN thing, or we can see this as really something that has taken all of these countries aback, that it's national interests first, and then we will gradually kind of expand our influence, or if you want to say the concerns we have to the region and then to our closest neighbors. That's, I think, personally why the APT was actually the first of the mechanisms to be kind of utilized by ASEAN, because yes, as we know, China is in there, Japan is in there, South Korea, they're also in there, and this is they've had varying degrees of success with the pandemic itself. That's not to say that we aren't, as a region, kind of shutting off the doors to other partners. We're definitely not saying that the I suppose the foreign ministers, they're pretty open about it. We've spoken to the Indonesian foreign minister. She said also that during the summitries that there have been talks with the US, with the EU, and all of that. But I think it's kind of really too early to say whether the impact of this pandemic is kind of far-reaching or very deep, because everyone is still kind of trying to cope with what's happening, I think. Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay. And Ibrahim?
Sure. So in terms of, has the COVID-19 sort of raised awareness of the failures of governments? I think definitely it has. We've seen a lack of testing. We've seen governments not being open with the data or being upfront about the situation. We've seen a very slow response from certain member states in terms of imposing lockdown. So the COVID-19 has very much highlighted some of the failures of governments. And I think this is why it's important to have ASEAN play a greater role, not just ASEAN, but also the wider international community. Now, this is not a situation that we can resolve on our own, but we do need the cooperation of everyone involved. In terms of Vietnam's chairmanship, definitely the COVID-19 has sort of disrupted its chairmanship this year. And I remember reading somewhere there are some speculations that they might extend Vietnam's chairmanship into next year, simply because a lot of its agenda has been sort of disrupted by what's going on. And the thing is, although a lot of our attention has been on the COVID-19, we are starting to see other issues sort of raised. So, for example, you mentioned the South China Sea, and we know that in the past few days there has been certain tensions in off the coast of Malaysia. I think there's a Chinese surveillance ship patrolling there. So these things sort of still carry on amidst all our concern about the global pandemic. And on the last point on the involvement of the greater powers, I would second what Dr. Fitri mentioned, which is we would welcome the involvement of anyone I was quite interested to how last week when Bumeni spoke at your webinar, she mentioned the ASEAN+3 Special Task Force. And I was wondering why the focus was solely on China, Japan, and South Korea, and why we wouldn't want to involve the other dialogue partners, the US, Australia, New Zealand. The way I see it, the more help and assistance we can get, the better. So I think those would be my responses.
Okay. Fifi, do you have any response or comment so far?
Sure, Gilang. Yeah, interesting. COVID-19. Well, in the past we've always said that South China Sea is the litmus test for ASEAN centrality and unity. But now there's COVID-19, a different type of crisis, and indeed, just as serious. And I think it has indeed become a test for ASEAN, whether or not the whole centrality and unity of ASEAN can survive this crisis. So with regards to Vietnam chairmanship, I do think that chairmanship in ASEAN, I wouldn't pay too much weight on it. It is something okay, a chair of ASEAN, but if you see the special ASEAN summit and then the other proposals, those have been Indonesia's proposal. So Indonesia was the country that took the initiative to propose these ideas of actually having a summit specifically discussing COVID-19, because before that we saw all of these countries were just handling it individually, and then proposals to create this fund, proposals to create this task force. So one way or the other, it doesn't really have to be the chair of ASEAN to take these initiatives, because I think that's been the practice in ASEAN since the beginning. So, but I do think that COVID-19 is already and will be the most difficult task for Vietnam during its chairmanship in ASEAN. Yeah, and I think it like I said, and the big question of our discussion today is what kind of adjustments does ASEAN need to take? Back, even though Indonesia has these initiatives, these proposals, but those are like the usual proposals that ASEAN always makes. Meetings, declarations, agreements. Do this really work in a crisis like COVID-19? It's a completely different kind of challenge that ASEAN has never faced before, that no country in the world has ever faced before. And I really don't think that in this type of crisis, these meetings and declarations and agreements are the answer to it. Back to you, Gilang.
Thank you so much, Fifi. And now we have more questions in our pot right now. Let me just look back, and I'll take 3 questions at the moment, and I'll jumble up a bit. Some of them are similar to one another. So I'll start with there's one from Killian Spandler. So there's this question on the involvement of the ASEAN AHA Center within the management of the pandemic. He comments that we assume that the AHA Center would be set up to have some kind of role in the emergency relief efforts surrounding the crisis. But we also know that sectoral siloing, a restricted mandate, as well as limited resources have limited its activities in the past. He asked any speakers on their insights within this, and whether ASEAN should look into enhancing the AHA Center's role in disease management, or does it rather need a dedicated ASEAN Center for Disease Control, as is the case with any other multilateral frameworks? So that's question 1. I'll take there's one from YouTube, from the Adam Report. He also would like to ask all the speakers, aside from recovery efforts and noting the importance of looking back to the first case in China, do you all speakers think that ASEAN should join the effort, he claimed, led by the US to, quote, pressure more information and clarification from China on the initial outbreak? Very interesting. And I'll take another one. I suppose this is a combination of 2 questions, but it has the same pretty much theme. It's one from Maula Muhammad Haikal and Agung Adrian from YouTube. says that noting both special ASEAN and ASEAN+3 summits resolved to cooperate in research, has there been any joint research and development collaboration for a possible vaccine among the 10 ASEAN member countries? So I hope that each of you managed to get a hold of the 3 questions, and I suppose I'll mix up for this one. I suppose I go start with Tama. Maybe you have something to say on this?
Yes, I was actually looking at Killian Spandler's question, and it struck me pretty quickly that this is actually very much the case. You see, for ASEAN, the tools are already there. They're all there. We have all sorts of things, from the research network for communicable diseases, infectious diseases. We have all of that. We have the AHA Center, rightly said, as well. But then we still use very much a business as usual approach, and that needs to be questioned. I would like to kind of take an example from the past few years alone, how AHA Center has been quite useful as the sort of the leading body to respond in crisis, particularly with regard to the Rohingya refugee crisis, the Rohingya crisis, as for some. I think this is very much a question of political will, because just in the last few years, when the crisis in Myanmar was coming to a head, and international scrutiny of the crisis kind of mounted, and pressure was mounting, we've seen ASEAN respond. We've seen the fact that the AHA Center, its mandate was expanded by the foreign ministers of ASEAN, just so they could also tackle this one issue that they would otherwise not really lead in, the repatriation efforts. Why AHA Center? And why was it made so that they had to be the leading, they had to take the lead? So it's not even a matter of whether ASEAN has the tools or the know-how. It's all there. And it just comes to show how political will is needed in order to move ASEAN forward. And I think with the COVID response, it should definitely be, it should, the ASEAN should step up, really, because this is a crisis at a very large scale. The Rohingya crisis pales in comparison to what we are facing right now. So why can't ASEAN mobilize or operationalize sort of these mechanisms that it has already at its disposal? And I think there was another question about how, or whether or not ASEAN is already kind of doing something in terms of researching antiviral drugs or vaccines. And I believe Thailand is it is like the center of the ASEAN network for research on this. And so I'm sure that the researchers there are doing something as well. I've also heard from some officials mentioning very briefly these points, but otherwise, it's just this trickle of information, I think, that that's kind of getting in the way of progress. I think that would be all from me for these points. I'm unsure whether I can comment on, the whole political dynamic of following the US-China debate in multilateral forums, because right now, I think there's even talks about it, the pandemic itself not originating from China. There are these these kinds of research taking place. So it would be just too early to kind of jump in, and very unlike ASEAN to do so, I think.
Okay, maybe we'll go over to Ibrahim.
Right. So maybe on the question of the AHA Center. So I think this question was asked to Bumende as well last week. And I remember she gave her response, which was that the primary body responsible for addressing the pandemic in ASEAN is the ASEAN Health Ministers meeting. And I think as Tama mentioned before, there is a sort of political issue in terms of who is responsible for which issue. And I think in this case, because this is a health issue, it should be the ASEAN health ministers that take the lead. Having said that, definitely the AHA Center has a lot of resources. It has a lot of experience in dealing with situations similar to this in the past. And the AHA Center has a very modern command center, which I think would be really useful to coordinate the responses of the ASEAN member states. So I think maybe ASEAN should look at maybe sort of retrofitting the AHA Center so that it can also play its part in responding to the global pandemic. On the issue of China and whether or not ASEAN should sort of work with the United States to put pressure on Beijing and in making it more honest about what happened there. I think certainly in time, there should be some sort of inquiry or research about what happened in the early stages, just so as to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But I think right now it would be very unproductive. It would be very unhelpful, and now it's just simply not the time to be asking those kind of questions right now. In terms of whether there's any sort of joint research by ASEAN research institutes for a vaccine, my understanding is that this falls under the mandate of the WHO, and I think rightfully, I think in this type of situation, it's better for us to involve as many stakeholders as possible. So to limit it to just the 10 ASEAN countries seems a bit defeating the purpose. Why not involve all the scientists from around the world in trying to produce a vaccine? So I think that would be my comments on the questions.
All right, thank you. I'll jump over to Habibie, please.
Sure, just a little bit on the AHA Center, because I think Tama and Ibrahim has made already very good comments on that. Indeed, I mean, it was interesting looking at that question posed to Ibu Menlu on Friday, and then the fact that she tried to answer it back. I mean, those are in charge are the ministers. So again, it shows that there's still this reluctance to go beyond the usual dealings of ASEAN, that the ministers are in charge and so on. So if I might go back to the documents that I mentioned in my presentation. So the AHA Center was mentioned in the ASEAN Summit declaration as a supported ASEAN emergency response mechanism. So it's mentioned, but still the main body is the ASEAN Coordinating Council, which is the ministers, and the relevant sectoral body, which is on the second layer, is the ASEAN Coordinating Council Working Group in Public Health Emergencies, instructed to support the ACC. So AHA Center is only one of the different mechanisms mentioned in there, alongside with the ASEAN Emergency Operations Center, the ASEAN Risk Assessment and Risk Communication Center, and the ASEAN Biodiaspora Virtual Center. So it's not anywhere near the leading institution to take care of COVID-19. On the second question on the ASEAN-China, we've talked about what kind of changes and adjustments that ASEAN should make, but I do think there is one change that should not happen to ASEAN with regards to ASEAN's continuous position not to choose any sides in a geopolitical rivalry among the US and China. I do think that is something that should not change and should not be adjusted. And I think it goes back to the 1967, since ASEAN's establishment, being the country to sort of like we call it in the evolution, it's then called in the driving seat and everything. And I think ASEAN needs to make sure that its position in terms of the geopolitical rivalry stays that way.
Brilliant. And lastly, Fitri, do you have any comments or answers to the questions I just asked earlier?
I think my answer would be same as other panelists. I think AHA Center has been appointed to and given greater, how do I say, authority, a mandate to actually deal with this. And previously, AHA Center was only dealing with natural disaster, not health disaster. So I think we actually seen how the AHA Center have to be really revolutionize itself to make itself relevant. I think it's a litmus test whether it has the enough capacity, whether it has sufficient funding, whether it's efficient and effective given the situation, the mechanism that ASEAN have. I want to answer whose question while answering this question, maybe Ruth Alicia, about that. Would it require fundamental change of ASEAN to be more adaptive and relevant in the future, especially with similar crises? I think having ASEAN a mechanism of non-intervention, of course, that will bring it's like not bringing criticism to other ASEAN member state. I think something gotta give. If we want to deal this issue as a region, we need to be transparent and we need to support each other in a way that we can. So I think ASEAN should change in terms of actually have its priority, right? And perhaps rather than prioritize being defensive, maybe it can like put the money where it should, the AHA Center, so it can actually work on a specific task that it was given, as well as open channel for them to actually do something. So because we're actually seeing Tama was saying before, that ASEAN wasn't really like AHA Center dealing with the Rohingya issue before, and still have constraint in that. And we know, their member states are reluctant to actually give its political commitment. And I think in this kind of crisis that we all, as all 10 ASEAN member, actually fear the burden, maybe we can increase our commitment. I think that's a call. That's for me, Gilang.
Okay, brilliant, Fitri. As Fitri mentioned, there was a question from Ruth Alicia asking about considering the nature of ASEAN, what kind of concrete role that ASEAN can suitably play to actually help its member countries to cope with current pandemic and its long-term impact. And I'd like also to bring up, I suppose, there are 3 questions here asking about the summit declarations and the documents that have been produced by it. And I suppose I can try to jumble it up into one. So there's a question from Yasmin Razidi in response to, I suppose it was Mbak Fifi's presentation. He's asking about why are these summit documents binding? Why aren't they in response to COVID-19 and the current pandemic? Can it not be binding? And then another question from Hananau Fanita from YouTube, saying that noting how ASEAN, through both summit documents, had taken attention towards the impact of COVID-19 to vulnerable groups such as SMEs and migrants, would this also mean an opportunity for more involvement from ICHR and ASEAN social cultural pillar mechanisms? If it is, what would be the best way to get them more involved? And lastly, on the issue of summit declaration, a question from Open Government Indonesia, I believe it's Bapenas. Is there any monitoring and evaluation mechanism to ensure that this summit declarations will not remain as mere promises or would end up as a dead end? Now, I leave 2 speakers to answer. I think the question first to Mbak Fifi. Maybe Mbak Fifi, you can start, and then the other speakers, if you feel free to jump in and want to answer these questions, feel free to unmute yourself and questions. But I'll start with Mbak Fifi, please.
Okay, no binding agreement, why? Let's ask the leaders why. So no, but there can be a lot of factors in this. One is that because the nature of the summits were quote unquote emergency. So it's done in a very short period of time. And I think Ibrahim mentioned about this working from home for, for a lot of the ASEAN Secretariat, and I think for everyone that is involved in the summit. So it's actually getting a binding document is a very long process, and I don't think that it could be done within a summit that was planned a week ahead. So I think from the very beginning, the spirit of the summit was not to create anything binding. So there was never an intention to do that. And I think it was discussed, throughout our discussions that, yes, I mean, you got to hand it to ASEAN. I mean, it's showing that they're there. It's showing that, regional cooperation is in motion, or, from some, the official statements from our foreign ministry says that, the ASEAN machine keep spinning. So that's the word that is used, and I think that's quite interesting. I mean, seeing that how ASEAN is involved in this. So why it's not binding? I think there was never an intention for it to be binding. It's a declaration. I mean, the summit one is called a declaration to declare that ASEAN is there, saying something about this issue. And then, with that in mind, then of course, then answering the question of, monitoring and everything, there's not going to be any monitoring. Like I said in the beginning, most of the points are proposals. It's included in the declaration, it's included in the statement, but they're still proposals. And if there should be a fund, we talked about it, how big is it, voluntary or not, it's the whole mechanism is not there. So I think it's still very early on to even imagine something monitoring can actually exist.
Anyone would like to jump in to answer the questions? No?
I think I'll try to answer a bit on monitoring. For this question, I think it's useful that we look back at what has happened with the G20. I think Fitri earlier has kind of already shown what each multilateral forum has done. And in this sense, we can say that ASEAN is quite on par with the G20, because as we remember, after the G20 summit, even before it, there was an open letter by a lot of these figures, internationally renowned. There are Nobelists, there are researchers, scientists. They all called for something very particular, which is an executive task force. And that is exactly the kind of body that is needed to let's say, to operationalize whatever decisions were made during the summitry for the G20. And this is precisely the same problem, I think, that ASEAN is having right now, because we do have the declarations, the joint statements there, and it is open-ended, and it is there for a reason. But yes, the next step would be to kind of delegate one body or set it up, or however, to kind of push this process forward. And by all means, I think this is something that ASEAN needs to make clear, because it seems to me that the ACC, the ASEAN Coordinating Council, will be leading for these different cross-sectoral efforts, regardless of whether there is the ASEAN health sector that's doing its thing, and then the financial sector doing its thing, and so it kind of comes together in my observation that the foreign ministers here will be the ones dictating kind of the way forward. So if they need to make or set up a new task force, then it should do so. ASEAN should do so quickly. I think, yeah, that's all I have to say for the one question there. Yeah, thank you, Gilang.
Okay, no worries. Let me jump into. Oh, Fitri, do you want to answer? something?
About the question from Open Government Indonesia about the monitoring, I think the way the ASEAN commit itself in terms of how they monitor and evaluate a progress is unfortunately it's project based, but we know that ASEAN have document like ASEAN Vision 2025, and that there they have actually commitment in terms of parts of it is like health, ASEAN health cooperation, so on and so forth. And I think that would be the benchmark. Of course, we already have the goal 2025, and the COVID actually lowered the attainment of those goals. And I think whether the monitoring and evaluation will be given to a specific declaration, I don't think so, because taking for example when Indonesia had Bali bombing, and then Indonesia gather ASEAN member states to actually declare a joint statement on counterterrorism. Nobody actually said that. How do you monitor and evaluate of this commitment? Of course, but that is actually a gateway in actually bringing forward the conversation into the whole ASEAN framework mechanism, bureaucracy, we can say, and I think it can be done through the benchmarking of ASEAN Vision 2025. Let's see, 25. Oh, no. 5 years from now, hopefully the crisis finish.
Lovely.
Back to you, Gilang.
So I'd like to jump into the questions from Andrew. I think he's asking about ASEAN's current institutional posture. How can it address the issue sufficiently, and what can they do? There's a complete version is you can able to access it from Zoom's Q&A section there. And also I want to bring you to an attention, also a question from Lucas Tambunan from our YouTube live chat. I think he's asking about how could ASEAN be more integrated in the fight against COVID-19, especially in the health sector. I think Tama, you mentioned something about the health sector being in the industrial part of ASEAN. So I think you're very sufficient to answer this. But then again, these two questions, I'd let anyone who wants to answer this first. Please go ahead.
Okay, I guess I'll just start with Lucas' question. I'm not a health expert by any means. I'm more in the IR space, but in terms of what's being done, the thing is, with the health sector, we've actually had concerns about the ASEAN health sector being under the chairmanship of Indonesia. Before it came, we started at the beginning of April, and for a few months we've already been thinking about how having someone like the current health minister of Indonesia, Terawan, oversee the regional response. And I have to say it's been quite concerning, to say the least. We have seen that a lot of the national posturing on COVID-19 has varied very much among the nations, and Indonesia counts itself as one of the most laid-back ones, I think, in my perspective, in terms of responding. Of course, there was a discussion among, I think, media leaders with Jokowi on this precise point, and it does kind of stem back. It stems in his approach to dealing with the population, and if you look into that, it's fairly understandable, I think. But once you have the same kind of thinking brought up to a regional level, that's where I think it's going to be a bit problematic, because we've seen that Singapore has done all it can to kind of mitigate the crisis. It has had exemplary communication, public communication, as opposed to Indonesia or the other countries, and even Vietnam, as we rightly discussed earlier, that they've been able to kind of flatten the curve right from the very beginning. Of course, you have to take into account how top down the Vietnamese government or system of government and kind of the character, I suppose, the culture of the people as well. And it was easier for them to kind of rein things in. But for ASEAN, yeah, Indonesia is still the biggest stakeholder, and I don't think we're fit, I think, to kind of lead the response. If anything, we try to be the biggest beneficiary of the regional response, and we still look to our neighbors to, for answers. I think that's what I can say.
Brilliant. Anyone would like to jump in on Andrew's questions?
I will read the question again. What are the current situation that Asian face? Whether it's an issue of collaboration that the organization is actually suboptimal body, or it's an issue of coordination, whereby the ASEAN already has a framework or frameworks that can institutionally be used, but hasn't been used so far to deal with COVID. I think the answer would be coordination problem. Again, we heard that we have a lot of framework. Tama already mentioned ASEAN have all the framework. We have the mechanism, but what's the real tangible result? Right, it is still a bit fussy, and that is, I think, why the previous question was saying how we can monitor it, how we can evaluate, because people are having their hopes so high of ASEAN. That's why the regional organization exists for over 5 decades, and we need to have something that to show that it perhaps can act more than not putting us into war with each other. I think so far that's the argument of how ASEAN is useful, is that we're not having war with each other. But can we make ASEAN more effective? I guess that's the issue, right? Yes, I think it's a coordination problem, and Tama was saying perhaps whether the person that was sent by government are actually committed or not committed, having the capacity. And of course, capacity is something that we cannot even demand equally from the 10 ASEAN member state, because 10 ASEAN member state have different capacity, and we cannot put like one country standard, like put Singapore standard in Indonesia. That wouldn't work, for example, and so on and so forth. So I guess the reason that ASEAN are working or coordinating very slowly is because not only we work from home, ASEAN people staff work from home, it also because every country can join with its own pace, and then perhaps we can go back to each country for their own. But what we have as well as part of a social capital and cultural capital in ASEAN is that we would not left our neighbor behind. So we like to give help and believe that we're in it together. And I guess that's my take. Please, Gilang.
Okay, brilliant. I'd like to raise other questions, but if anyone wants to jump back to answer Andrew's questions, they're more than welcome. But just allow me to raise up one more question this is from Killian Spandler. I think Killian is he's mentioning specifically to you, Ibrahim. Ibrahim has briefly mentioned the issue of populism in the beginning. He comments that within Europe, efforts by populist parties and leaders to capitalize on COVID-19 to further their own agenda have so far seen mixed results. Populists in power, such as Viktor Orban, are able to instrumentalize the crisis to extend their authority. Opposition parties, for example, in Germany and Sweden, are sidelined. Now, how have domestic politics and populist strategies in ASEAN member states played into the regional response so far? So maybe Ibrahim, you can comment and answer this question.
Sure. So on the issue of populism, I think on the one hand, yes, we have seen certain politicians have used sort of populist appeals to further their own agenda, and they've sort of manipulated this sort of COVID-19 situation to sort of gain popularity. But what we're saying is that it hasn't always been effective, and you know, what we see in the United States or Brazil or maybe the Philippines, these sort of populist leaders have shown themselves not to be great leaders in crisis. Yes, they can sort of whip up public sentiment, they can sort of get people on their side, but when it comes to providing policy recommendations, policy solutions that is very much needed, they have been found wanting. And I think that will be the takeaway from what we're seeing in Europe, that they're not always the best people in place. And we're seeing that in Indonesia as well, for example. We know that the government has been somewhat hesitant to impose lockdowns because they're concerned about the economic implications and whether that would make them maybe less popular amongst the public. And this has only sort of made the situation worse. A lot of European countries are already thinking about easing their lockdown restrictions. And here in Indonesia, we've only just started to, put in place the large-scale social distancing. So I think, there is this sort of balance between populism and the science, and ideally it should be the science that comes on top. So I think that would be my sort of comments on that.
Okay, wonderful. So I think we're just about to run out of questions at this moment. Let me just double check again. Okay, so there are two questions I would like to raise here. One is about the economic impact. This is a question from Yasmin Razidi on the economic impact of COVID-19 on ASEAN members, comparing to that on EU member countries, and whether ASEAN members can what can ASEAN members do to minimize this impact, especially on healthcare system and etc. So anyone would like to answer on that, I welcome you. And there's a question from Huang Wan. He said that I think it's unfair to criticize ASEAN's performance dealing with COVID-19, especially when comparing with other regional and international institutions. Even the European Union cannot push for a regionally coordinated response as a unified health policy within its national authority. But at least ASEAN was quick in raising the issue and showed political will. Now, the problem is for ASEAN to operationalize its ideas, and this is where academic can play its role. So within each of your opinion, what are the imperative and concrete actions that ASEAN must take? So I don't know if anyone would like to answer. Some of these questions may have been some repetition in the past, but I'll leave it up to you. So anyone would like to begin? If anyone would like to answer these questions, feel free to do so, please.
I'll comment on the second question you mentioned, Gilang. I don't think the criticisms is really towards ASEAN's performance. For those knowing ASEAN and how it goes, they would know the limitations of ASEAN, and it's the criticism is not an ASEAN as a regional organization itself, but the criticism is more on the actual willingness of some of these countries to actually want to cooperate regionally. We've been mentioning that a lot of resources and efforts for these countries are already spent domestically in fighting COVID-19. So regional cooperation, it's only natural for them that regional cooperation seems to be knocked down, in the list of priorities further down, and the resources are spent domestically. And what is concerning, and I think this is, if I can make a self-promotion for CSIS, I mean, CSIS has been running this CSIS commentaries, and I've written on this. My concern is that countries are pushed to cooperate because there's so many calls for, international cooperation is important, regional cooperation is important, and countries are pushed to actually, commit to something they don't have the capacity to commit for at the moment. Maybe in the future when things are settled down domestically and they can focus more on their foreign policy and regional cooperation, and that's fine. But for now, I think it's in the criticism, like I said, is not towards ASEAN, but actually how serious are these countries in Southeast Asia into actually trying to use ASEAN to resolve COVID-19 issues.
Brilliant. Anyone else would like to jump into the questions? Maybe just one more. There was a question from Alistair Cook. It's similar to what Killian Spandler asked about AHA Center, where he asked about whether AHA Center should be the overarching coordinating body, and then individual sectors within the health sectors or the Ministry of Health led most likely. So that's just something I'd like to add within the pool of questions. Other than that, also another one from Andrew, just a follow-up. He mentioned that coordination problem is also a problem that persists at national level. We have different governmental agencies that are uncoordinated to respond to COVID-19. Within regional level, cross-sectoral and cross-pillar mechanism. This is a question of authorization where stronger power structure needed to be revisited. Within regional level, I am afraid that the more ASEAN states resort to greater power or here extra regional power because we are in need of redistribution, such as medical supplies and etc. The more ASEAN proves that the current ASEAN power is not enough, convening powers, for example. Would the pandemic accelerate ASEAN to facilitate transformation of regional power constellation? Or is there anything we can do to maintain ASEAN centrality in times where global redistribution of vaccines, medical supplies put some countries in ASEAN below the bar? I suppose that's the other two questions that I'd like to raise. Also, anyone would like to join in, just jump in and answer the question.
I'll try to answer Andrew's question regarding, just give my 2 cents of comment. I think ASEAN has its own merit. I think ASEAN cannot solve all the problems. Perhaps like what Fifi was saying, it doesn't have the capacity perhaps, or we're just being like not that fast in dealing with the issue. And some countries are pushed to cooperate. So, what I'm trying to say is perhaps ASEAN can have its own merit in dealing with issue, for example, having internal migrant. So I think the reason, or my take, the reason that Indonesia it's pushing forward to have this ASEAN meeting on COVID is actually because Indonesia have migrant worker across ASEAN countries. We have businesses, our unicorn spreads in other ASEAN member states, and I think it is something that would impact Indonesia. So of course the approach is perhaps really the Indonesia interest, but also I think we can see it that we have a merit of like regional cooperation, that there is an interest that perhaps learning to hear about what other countries take on the issue as well, and perhaps we can give and take. So before the platform is established, we don't have actually mechanism to talk. I think what was the merit of ASEAN as a convening power still hold is merit. I think maybe smaller country cannot actually call for it. So Indonesia is calling for it. There are other migrant worker, other smaller country as a member state that send migrant workers in other countries. So I think it's what Indonesia do is good. I don't know in regard of resorting to the greater power. For what my take, what I seen is we saw. Should I say the name? So we saw President Trump is trying to blame a certain country of not being transparent enough, and then and trying to how do I say get the support to blame that certain country. And I don't want really sorry, before getting there, that we create a backlash, or it create a response that country then rally support from other country to not being blamed. It said that I'm trying to be transparent enough, I'm giving help the extent that I can, you know, and it's just unfortunate situation. So I don't want ASEAN to be taken into the Cold War like situation, and then to go to what Ibrahim was saying, perhaps this is some sort of a warlike situation. I hope not. It's kind of I think we can focus on the things that we can do right now, and learning from the best practices of other region. So to comment as well for the comment or Orang Huang maybe, because I feel guilty because I give presentation about EU and perhaps African Union. I don't feel that I'm blaming ASEAN for whatever ASEAN is actually conducting right now. It is moving in the limitation it has as a regional organization, in a different kind of framework it has, which is non-binding and voluntary and non-intervention. So I'm not trying to compare ASEAN with EU or African Union. Is a different fruits altogether, and different paths, and the reason that African Union actually been more open and communicating of its disease and making the African Union website as a stop, giving public information, because they dealt with Ebola crisis before, and public information is the one that they achieve. So I don't want to compare. I'm sorry if I make it that way. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Fitri. Maybe just several last answer and comments from Ibrahim or Tama, perhaps, just before we wrap things up.
Yeah, no, just on the issue of ASEAN, I think it's important when we're talking about ASEAN to remind us of what actually ASEAN is. You know, ASEAN is a grouping of 10 member states of different size, of different capacity, capabilities, and with different interests. So when we're talking about, you know, what ASEAN should do, what it shouldn't do, it's important to remember this. And I think Dr. Shafiah mentioned before, you know, ASEAN is only as strong as its weakest member. And so that explains why, you know, maybe ASEAN hasn't been as active or visible in responding to the COVID-19, simply because it is being sort of hamstrung by its more weaker members, which isn't necessarily the smallest states, but can be, you know, we might argue that Indonesia is being one of the problem states as well. So I think that's one thing that's important to remember about ASEAN. The other thing is that a lot of these issues will be a state-centric solution. As much as we talk about ASEAN as the regional organization, that there's a lot of hope on ASEAN, it remains the case that it will be the member states that will have to be the ones that take the action and implement the policies. So if they're not up to the job, then, you know, it reflects on ASEAN, but I think it's very unfair to place the blame solely on ASEAN.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Tama, any last comments, perhaps?
I think I'll just respond to Huang's question about what some of the things there are that ASEAN can do, especially when it comes to I guess resorting to the wealth of the resources that academics may have. And so I have three. First of all, I think it's very important that ASEAN can provide a strong, consistent, and transparent communication. This is, first of all, key to earning the people's trust. In this sense, I think ASEAN is less visible than the national responses that we've had on COVID-19, and rightly so. Like, I think ASEAN is at a level where it can't immediately affect what's happening on the ground, and so the least it can do is actually be transparent about what it's doing and all the information that's going along, who's doing what research and all that. That would be the first step. Second of all, I think it's important here to frame health as human right. and inject this into the cross-sectoral thinking. Because if you think of something as a human right, then it negates all other considerations. You have to get as many people, there should be more people who can claim this right than, as opposed to just leaving them to die, because that's mostly what's happening around the world, and not just in ASEAN. Some countries simply don't have the resources to respond, and people end up dying. And so I think if they can establish a health in the frame of a human right, then I think it would be one way ASEAN can operationalize its mechanisms. And of course, the last one would be, and I think this has a lot to do with what Fitri and even Ibrahim has said before me, and it's to raise their lowest common denominators. Because, I mean, if you think about it, really, community interest is self-interest in this case, because, as a health crisis, everyone is involved, and no one's, left, no one is none the richer if everyone just keeps thinking to themselves. I think that should be it for me.
Well said from both you gentlemen, and also from ladies. Thank you very much. And I think we can all agree that at this stage, how precious health is, and we strive to find a future where every not just ASEAN countries, but the nationalities that live within the borders of ASEAN can go to a clinic or go to a health professional and get the most transparent and the most straightforward information on whatever condition that they have, real time, straight and dead ahead. I don't think any playing secrets or keeping things from the greater public is not in the interest of all mankind, I suppose. And it's a future that we all aspire to. I think it's definitely something that we can hope for ASEAN, maybe in the next couple of years, maybe in the next decade, we still don't know. But at this stage, I can only wish and can only pray for everyone's well-being, everyone's health, and etc. And hopefully we can all see each other again without face masks, of course. As much as I'm now accustomed to Zoom, I'm afraid to say I'm a very old soul. I hate using, I mean, I don't hate it, but I prefer going face-to-face and talk to you guys in private. But again, thank you so much to the speakers. Thank you so much to all of you participants who stayed until the end of this webinar. It's been a 2-hour, very enjoyable, very interesting discussion, and definitely we look forward for future information about CSI's webinar. We'll keep it posted in our Twitter page, and don't forget that it's also available on our YouTube channel. Again, thank you very much, Afifi. Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Tama, and thank you, Fitri. Stay healthy and stay happy. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.